Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and we're just delighted to get such a good turnout. And there are a number of things that we're happy about, and I'd like to warm up by saying some thank yous. I know some of you came from farther away, and many of you are from Sonoma County, and we have all together been through a collective scare and some people lost just recently again, which brought back old losses, of course. And so we're really grateful. We're really grateful to be on this land. We're grateful to this land and for its vitality. And we're grateful also because it is the land of people who are still here, Coast Miwok people, Kashaya Pomo people, other peoples just to the inland, different languages, and people who really knew this land and know this land in many ways, and we always want to acknowledge that. But we're also very grateful this time to the firefighters who came from all over the West to help preserve as much of this county as we could. Yeah. And their dedication to keeping it from crossing the gauntlet at 101 and keeping the West County unburned so far. So that's something we're really grateful for, but also for the entire community and all the people who have helped in so many ways to form fire-safe groups and to feed displaced people and just to help with the evacuation and the reentry and have a sense of humor about the things we could barely tolerate, like electric companies and things like that. And so I think many of us just our hearts are warmed by the way we take care of each other and what we're learning about this way of being in the world where there seem to be more emergencies and urgencies than there used to be. We are at the Occidental Center for the Arts. That's what this community arts center is, and we're grateful to be a member of that, a part of it. We, in this case, is Botanical Dimensions, the nonprofit organization that I co-founded 35 years ago, and that has its library right down this way. Some of you know it well. Some of you have not even been aware there was an ethnobotany library here in the West County. But there is, and it's fascinating, and it's just right here. It'll be open after the event tonight for perusal. And but first I want to say something about OCA, Occidental Center for the Arts, and how really grateful we are to Tina Marchetti, who's here. She's one of those many armed women who knows how to do everything, from run a nonprofit organization, which this Occidental for the Arts is, and run the sound equipment. She's doing sound tonight. She made many of the cookies that hopefully you will buy and eat. And, this is part of the feminine, right? And so I don't know how many arms she has, but I know it's a lot, and I'm really grateful, Tina, for you're always our advocate. You really help us. If you are in this region and you'd like to be a member of the Occidental Center for the Arts and get on their mailing list, then you'll find out about all the cool literary and musical kinds of events that they have right here on this stage, too. So I encourage you. Botanical Dimensions is also a nonprofit and dedicated to the study and sharing of what we learn about the long, broad relationship between human beings and plants and fungi. It's a really big category. It goes from the ancient past into the present in all the different cultural modes in the world into the future. It's an evolutionary field. Ethnobotany is, some people seem to think it's just in the past, but it's not. It's always evolving, just as all human knowledge is always evolving, and so is nature. So we offer classes. There's a classroom down this way. We have the library itself. The library functions on donations and memberships. Membership is $35 per person for a year. You can come once for free, and then we hope we'll make you a cup of tea and enchant you, and you just won't be able to stay away, and so you'll become a member, and that will really help us. And then you'll become a renewable member, like where you just automatically renew, that kind. We really love that kind. And frankly, we are also, we're small and fringy and always have been, and have these mostly out-of-sight projects. This is the first place, it's been the last 4 years that we've been here, but the first time in the history of Botanical Dimensions that we had a base here in the States. Our project, or in California at least, our projects have been in Hawaii, in Peru, in Ecuador, in Costa Rica, and then in Mexico, which you will see in the film. And so, I don't know, I have, the film is called Almost Visible, and I'm going to say more about that in a moment, but I just find that it's a tongue-in-cheek title because it's so much good work goes on in the invisible realm. So many nonprofits in the world are doing good work and are not the big flashy ones that are advertising everywhere or that get the giant donors or great big awards. And there's hundreds of thousands of small nonprofits doing really good work. And I just encourage you, I mean, in a way, from my point of view, the whole theme of the evening is look beneath what is obvious, because there's just a rich world there. It's like the mycelial world. It's just filled with surprises. And please, if you have resources, orient them to these small groups that are steadily getting by, often on volunteer labor and skimpy budgets and with little crises that you also don't hear about, So be generous, please, and we would love to talk with you about big things like bequests and all that kind of thing, we really would. But anything is really helpful, and it helps you be part of this community, which has become, in these several years here, a very cool community of plant-loving people, mushroom-loving people, and of all sorts, including the psychedelic people among those. And so if you're solely a psychedelic person, think about branching out and getting to know a non-psychedelic plant person. They're also fascinating. Mix it up, and we come together around all of these topics, and we have rich discussions. So it's an oddball community. It's totally privileged to be able to generate it and to put out something like tonight's topic, the psychedelic mysteries of the feminine, and be able to fill the room. I mean, that is just wonderful because, we have 3 titles here, the 3 words, and I love words, but they're all great, big, hard to pin down, ineffable terms, actually. Psychedelic, mystery, and feminine. Who can define any of these, And so the brilliant editors, and you'll meet one of them in a bit, put together those 3 words into a great big sphere of the ineffable, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight. I want to thank the people who help us within BD, and that would be our program coordinator, Nikki Sauer, who's here, and here, of course, and managing everything, and all of the volunteers as well. Thank you, each of you. Thanks, Yarrow, for doing the audiovisual and the video. We're videotaping tonight to be able to share this at the request of many people who couldn't come. And Tina for doing the sound, and Sue for doing the refreshments over there. Feel free to get up and get yourself something, buy something, or leave a donation during the presentation. We have so much we want to share. We didn't plan an intermission. So restrooms out this way, refreshments are on this side, there's water. I'll say there will be books for sale afterwards in the gallery right here, out the door, and then in the next door. And if you'd like your books signed, the editor and authors will be in the library a few doors down farther signing. And so that's the stream of things after the end of the talks tonight. And also, now we're going to, well, because of the fire, maybe you all know, we had to postpone this by a week, and we postponed our book sale to March. We don't have a date yet, but in March we will have the big annual book sale because we just couldn't put 2 whole things together on short notice and reschedule. But we are, we moved this one by a week, and you all showed up, so that is just that is just wonderful. And we decided to add a half an hour on the beginning of it and include this film that my daughter and I and videographer friend Ruthie Ristich and the editor Dana Lehman and my friends in Mexico have been working on for a while. That's what I want to share with you now. My daughter, Clea McKenna, is the director, and really, friends and I had been trying to get it going, but she really got involved and said, in true, strong, daughterly fashion, "Mom, I'd love to help you, but I can only help you if I'm in charge." And so I said, okay, because I want to see it happen, and she is a manifester, and so she would be here tonight, but she's about to have her second baby at any moment. So I'll be heading down there, hopefully not tonight. And this film is, it's only 12 minutes long. This is just what we call a teaser, and I'm learning documentary language. It will be, we hope, an hour-long documentary film. It is about the long relationship that I've had in the last 25 years of visiting and getting to know multiple generations within an indigenous Mazatec family, a clan really, in the mountains of Oaxaca and then down into the high valleys of the Tehuacan Valley. Many things have happened in that 25 years. I didn't go down to document. I went looking for ethnobotanical knowledge and relationship and healing. Some of that you'll see in the film. But over that long a time, so many things happen, and so many stories are collected, and photographs come from all different sources. And I've taken, my daughter a few times, and then my niece once, and different friends, each one at a time, and collected images and impressions from each of them until and I began to write about it and just write stories and essays. But then just a few years ago, it became clear that I could not write something objective, like this is what Mazatec people are like. First of all, I don't want to essentialize them. This is just one clan. They have their own engagement with the 20th and 21st century, and what it really is a network of intricate friendships and trust and challenges and new babies coming and terrible luck occurring, and the changing story of poor people in Mexico as part of it. And some parts of this story have global implications, and others are very personal. But that is what is unique about the kind of so-called ethnobotany that I've been doing for my adult life. And Clea and others pointed out that is the thing that is most valuable to share. And so let's make a film, and let's make it archival out of all of these different photographs and records and snippets of video, and make it big enough of a documentary to include this arc of changes that has occurred in the lives of these people, and that is a lens for people who don't live so marginally. We don't live marginally. We're privileged. We're here. We're white. We're in the world of comfort and enough to eat. And so we don't have insights often into the deep lives and losses and humor of very poor people. And then this clan, I don't know how different they are from any other extended family in the world, but they're exceptional in my eyes. And so we have been trying to create a way with them, with their participation. You'll see the young women in this family, all the way down to a 10-year-old boy, using the cameras, using the sound equipment, interviewing each other. It will have all of these different parts to it. They're part of it. They love this. They call it our mission. And they don't know what will happen to the film. We don't know either. But they know that we have something precious, and we're honoring it by recording it. So we're fundraising for that. We really appreciate that we got a nice seed funding from River Styx Foundation. Thank you very much to Cody and Miriam and Bob for helping with that. Thank you to any of the donors here in the room and for those who entice other donors to help us out. We really, really appreciate that. But we do need to fundraise a lot more to take this 12-minute film and make it into an hour long and give it the value that and the distribution, hopefully, that we think it deserves. Might take us another year and a half. Depends on these babies. These darn wonderful babies just keep appearing. And it depends on many things. But I want to show it to you, and then we're going to not discuss that afterwards, and we'll then switch into the other mode, which is talking about the book. And at that point, I'll introduce the other speakers, and we'll each do readings, and then we'll have a three-way conversation on stage here between ourselves, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We have a mic for questions for people to come up, and we plan to be done by 9 o'clock tonight, so let's hope that really happens, okay? Or you're going to have to eat cookies all night long. Okay, thank you. I think we're ready for the film. Thank you very much. When I was around 18 or 19 and people would ask me what I wanted to be, I would sometimes say, I want to be amazed. The person that I knew myself to be was a traveler, and that was travel to go find something, learn something, and then share something. But I wasn't sure how that would manifest. Early 1995, I knew that I had been living very tenuously, the family falling apart, Terrence and I splitting up, and the question of who am I? I had been so involved in his career, and then I had this heart issue which had begun in the week that Terrence and I split up. It was a dark time. Kids were away for 2 weeks, so I pulled together a little money and came to the state of Oaxaca, sola. I ate Salvia divinorum leaves while in the presence of a great feminine being. I talked with La Pastora, asking for guidance. Show them the edge of the garden. Mostrelos la orilla del jardín.
Not the obvious thing to do in that situation. During this period, the early years of you going there, I was a young teenager here. But I think that in my memory of all of this, there's you, the broke single mom in California with teenage kids going off the rails, and then there's you, the exotic explorer doing your work in Mexico. But I had kind of separated the two stories.
I mean, I was hungry for the experience, but I was really seeking a perspective on my life situation from another worldview. And whether that came through a psychedelic experience or an awakening that I had by going to the edge, go to the edge and something will happen, that would be the cure.
Немножко постулано, то пина хена шин. Ну за чига нага. Вандиао га 사간 용나가 그 최, 무슨 그 최나 이렇게 토나간 용 이렇게 양호스야. 해나 시 팅나간 용나 상당히 신 상당가 顶上呢，我还能听见，可是我是上送的去呢，就是有地方 튕기를 간다는 거. 그다음에 어선 시해 간다를 땄어.
Yo que sepa, mi abuelo es curandero. Para mí es algo muy bonito, porque no todo es medicamentos, inyecciones, no todo es eso, sino mi abuelito se basa en plantas medicinales.
I first met Don Rutilio Andrade in 1995, summertime, mushroom season. He says that he got involved in all of this, in learning to be a healer when he was a young boy, when he was 11 years old. And he said many people were getting sick and people were dying.
Ajá, el honguito, bueno, le dicen honguito alucinante. Es para, pero siempre debe de estar un curandero para darle una ceremonia.
Es para, te ayuda a cómo seguir el camino, porque si no te puedes quedar a medio y no regresas igual. Y ahora sí.
Early in the 70s, there was this period of about 6 or 7 years that they now still refer to as the hippie invasion. And it did change Huautla greatly. A lot of Mazatec people just became very closed and private people. And then I came in 20 years after that.
Your method of research essentially is working through relationship, but you also seem somewhat surprised that you were kind of swept up into relationships.
Yes, the relationships became more powerful than the research.
¿Cuánto tiempo ha conocido a Carla?
Uy, muchos años.
Sí.
Muchos años. Me conoció como de 8 años. Ahora tengo 30 años. Pues sí, es algo raro, como dice ella, porque no hay amistades así tan largas.
Sí.
Tan largas. Y ha visto a la familia crecer también, y pues es bonito de que también yo sepa un poco de su familia, sí, y ella de nuestra familia.
Catalina, she returns again and then again. They trusted always that I would come again. Cycle is so important. Things of value don't just happen once.
It's Fiona. This was a break from traditional academic kind of boundaries of anthropology and how to work that had been laid out, in the early 20th century by men. And this,
yes. In the mid-90s, Ruth Behar and others developed a method of subjective witnessing. I mean, you can't go in as an observer. That old fallacy of actually see a scene without changing it, that doesn't happen. And do you embrace that as part of a dynamic, as long as they're embracing it? With your hearts connected, if you're lucky enough to develop a relationship, a context like that, what do you learn there? Internationally, there were things shifting that were going to change life in Mexico for poor people, and one of those was NAFTA. China came in and opened up factories. I just saw many women, single moms with their families, looking at, can we make it here? Josefina was among those, and in desperation she took her 4 kids and she moved to Tehuacan, and she got a job in a maquiladora, which is a clothing factory. Very dubious practices, very low pay to the people, and that meant really scratching out a living on the street. And then the rules changed and China pulled out. Their jobs were lost then. So we've watched that transition happen, and we followed the fates of those who moved down to the lowlands.
I feel like we've watched them go from subsistence farmers to basically urban poor.
Pues se va a desaparecer, o sea, ya no va a haber el mazateco, se van a perder las tradiciones, los eventos, todo se va a perder. Yo soy la última de la familia y es bonito, la verdad, es muy bonito. Y yo ahora sí hubiese querido estar más tiempo allá para poder haber aprendido más y estar más allá que acá. La verdad, sinceramente, me gusta más allá que acá. Me gusta mucho más allá que acá. Y pues ahora sí quisiera lo mismo para mi hija, el bienestar de ella y ahora sí que no perdiera nada de las costumbres que tenemos nosotros. Sí, la verdad, igual lo mismo.
Somos pasajeros este mundo, llegamos viejo o joven, pero pues que pues tenemos que aceptar las cosas.
I first started bringing my daughter, Clea, when she was about age 21. I wanted her to understand me better. I wanted to see that world through her eyes, as well as show that world to her. I had fallen in love with people there, and I wanted to show the people I love to each other. Just wanted to connect them.
To me, the other big ethical question in this work is who benefits? What is our effect on them? Because we haven't stood back and observed. We've intervened a lot.
Yes. I like to follow the spiritual and cultural mandate of reciprocity, that nothing should be given just one way. And that has to be the ethic that I go by as a subjectively heart-engaged, anthropologically oriented ethnobotanist. We owe the medicine itself and the people who held it. We owe them the respect of acknowledging them and of learning from them. It's just like a language. There's a stream of knowledge embedded in rituals and practices that has taken hundreds or thousands of years to develop. Techniques that shape it so that it isn't just like colorful chaos. That partly comes out of the skill of navigating by people who understand it well and whose ancestors have even understood it. They'd never related to an outsider before. And Don Rutilio says to this day, it felt like destiny. It was laid out as a potential network of connections, and all we had to do was say yes. She reached out and ran her hands through us, like a breeze, like a ripple, and I knew in those moments that my body was clear, in perfect order. Signor Rutilio, Cipriano, Signora Luisa, and the 7-year-old granddaughter, Rosalba, all paying her attention. I realized we were all plants at the edge of her garden. Okay? Oh, good. Thanks. Well, I hope you found that interesting, and maybe you'd like to see it completed, and if you can offer some help toward that, we would really appreciate it. This is wobbling, so I'm going to have to try not to lean on it. Okay, thank you for your attention. We are now going to talk about this book, Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine. And we are just very fortunate that paths crossed in a certain way, and even with the fire and the displacement and postponement and all of that, that we still have one of the editors here who's also a contributor to it, Chiara Baldini, and we have another author who contributed to this book, Annie Oak, and I wrote a chapter in the book as well. And so that's what brought us together. We knew each other through the production of the book, which Chiara will tell you about, and through the origin of it having been started at a conference in Europe. And so I just feel really lucky that in Chiara's travels, she included the Bay Area and is spending enough time here that she was flexible to move it, and you all get to see and hear something about the inception and creation of this idea and the various contributors to work on this theme, which we will then explore some with readings and discussion. Chiara Baldini. Oh, and Chiara and Annie, would you like to come up and sit here? Chiara, you can just come by me, and Annie, you can take your seat there. Thank you. Chiara Baldini is an independent researcher from Florence, Italy. Her focus is the evolution of the ecstatic cult in the West, particularly in ancient Greece and Rome. In 2010, 2012, 2014, and 2018, she co-produced Boom Festival's cultural area, the Liminal Village. The Boom Festival is a major cultural festival and music festival in Portugal each year. There are several big ones there. I think Boom is the biggest one. And in 2015 and 2016, she inaugurated and co-curated the program of Content, the new cultural area at the Fusion Festival in Germany. She lives in South Portugal, and she is also a DJ. Welcome.
Thank you.
Do you want to come up here?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Kat. Thank you, Botanical Dimension, for hosting this event. And yeah, I'm gonna start by saying that it's very exciting for me to be here. So my heart is racing, I'm sweating, I'm like trying to keep calm. It's really a huge honor to be here on this stage with these two amazing women, powerhouses, psy-goddesses. And yeah, it almost like this moment for me almost has an hallucinatory quality. Is this real? Is this really happening? So I'm gonna speak about how this happened, like what was the process that brought me here now. So I would like to pick up the thread starting from this event in Europe, in Basel in 2007. That was one of the first psychedelic forums that happened in Europe. And I went there, I was 32, and it was my first psychedelic congress. I loved the topics. I was already into the scene for some years through the psychedelic festivals that I was already attending for some years. I had already started my research, which started in 2004 after a strong experience in the dance floor of the Boom Festival, where in a way I got the information that I needed to research. How did we get here? I saw this amazing event, amazing energy in the dance floor, incredible feeling of oneness, and this was so powerful and transformational and political also, more than any other event that I had attended. And yeah, my question was, is this something new or is it an old way? Is it a new way to do something old? So this was the starting point of my research, and I wanted to learn what was the Western tradition of practicing altered states of consciousness. And particularly, I started researching Greek and Roman times, because these times for me hold a very special quality of being a time in between our primitive history and before Christianity and the advent of patriarchy. So what happened in this time in between? I really think that to study and to reflect on this time can bring a lot of understanding and insights about the whole evolutionary trajectory of these practices. So I was already researching in a very spontaneous way. I have a degree in linguistics, so this was not my area of academic study, and I was putting together information randomly. And I went to this conference, and I noticed, among other things, that there were very few women talking. The exceptions were Kathleen Harrison, so that was my first introduction to her. And the other one that I saw was Caroline Garcia, Mountain Girl. So I would like to express my respect for the California girls for being there as the pioneers of psychedelic research in this kind of context. And I know that also Annie was there, and she even mentions it in her essay in the book. And so, I was like, why there is not so many women? This scene actually is supposed to be inclusive and progressive and have like a deeper understanding of the need for different voices and different perspectives. So then I met Maria Papaspiro, that is my co-editor in the book. And in 2014, I invited her to speak in the Boom Festival, because in the meantime, I had become the curator of the cultural area of the festival. And so the theme for 2014 was the feminine. And so she spoke about the connection between feminine archetype and altered states of consciousness, and which are the connections in the fact that they were both repressed by the mainstream culture. And so this talk became an essay that actually became the opening essay of the book. Then the following year, 2015, she invited me to be part of a panel that was called Femtheogenesis. And in this panel, it was me, it was Kathleen, it was Maria, Anna Luke, and Daniela Peluso. So this was the first time that in one of these conferences we were giving visibility to women perspectives and to bring out women's research in these topics. And so the talks were amazing. Everybody was quite moved in the audience. We had amazing feedback. And one morning during the conference, I woke up and I thought, we need to make an anthology about this. We need to gather more of this research and put it together in a book. And so I spoke with Maria, and I spoke with David Luke, that is the other co-curator. He's one of the organizers of Breaking Convention. This is a huge biennial conference happening in London that gathers many different streams of research and different people populating the very eclectic psychedelic world. And so I said, why don't we do an anthology? And an idea whose time has come is going to be supported by the universe, I believe. And so this is what happened. At the beginning, there were resistances. We already have too much work, but actually, it was a good idea in a good moment. And so we decided to go for it. And we launched a call for paper through our networks. And we talked in this call for papers about the fact that psychedelic culture is not feminist enough, and feminism is not psychedelic enough. And so, so in a way, it was bringing out the perspectives that are at the fringes of the fringe, and really exploring what is in these liminal spaces. When we overlap these topics, so what do we see in between? And so we got amazing abstracts, in response, which gave us even more motivation to go on. And we started putting the book together. So we were guided by a principle of validating one's path towards knowledge. And so we wanted to have people that were coming from very different paths of life. And so we are very pleased, actually, with the variety of voices that we managed to gather, because we have renowned scholars and PhD students. We have academic and independent researchers. There's poets, lawyers, painters, and for sure, I'm forgetting medicine women, of course, herbalists. And so really we managed to put together a big variety of voices. We were also guided by a principle of inclusivity, and we were so inclusive that we decided to also welcome men among the contributors. And we felt that their perspectives were also part of the dialogue, and especially when talking about the feminine as a principle, which resides both in women and in men. And actually, the essays that they ended up writing are about the shadow of the feminine, or the dark feminine, or feminine and shadow. This is the titles. So I think it's really interesting to see which topics they decided to address. But also, I said we were guided by this principle of inclusivity, but also now we need to see that in terms of racial identity, racial diversity, and gender identity, there is still a gap to bridge. And we believe in the importance to acknowledge it, and also in the need to work more to bridge that gap in the future. And so in terms of topics, we have a very wide range, and I cannot name all of them, but I would like to say that the first section is about the archetypal dimensions, especially talking about in the realm of the psyche, mainly from a Jungian perspective. And then the second section is more about the history of ecstatic practices and what is the place of women within this history. And we have Max Dashu, that also lives somewhere in California, I'm not sure where. And she wrote an amazing essay talking about the whole global perspective on female shamanism, or women as shaman. And with her huge experience in compiling the repressed history archives since 1970, she's really an expert of this topic. And then we have other essays that covers the topic of female shamanism in Europe, both from the Southern European perspective, so about Greece mainly and Rome, and then the Northern European perspective, so focusing on Norse mythology, also extremely interesting topics, and maybe we will discuss more later about this. And then we have a section about embodied wisdom and the importance of body-oriented practices and embodied wisdom as a path to knowledge and healing. And also we have the visionary painters talking about the way that they, how they come up with their paintings. Is it something that they plan? Is it something that happens spontaneously? In which state of mind they are while they're painting, and which kind of images and symbols and archetypes come through their art. Then we have poets, and also three very beautiful poems. And then the last part is about psychedelic feminist activism. And there we have Annie Oak's essay, and you will hear more about it because she will read from it, about the Women Visionary Council. And then also another important essay that closes the book is about feminist perspective on drug policy reform, and the importance to really understand the importance of cognitive liberty as a human right, and how the Declaration of Human Rights, and especially Article 8, that points to the right to self-determination, how this article should be the way that the direction that we can point to finally manage to shift the perspective on repression and prohibition. So it's an amazing essay written by Charlotte Walsh, the lawyer. And I really invite you to take a look at that, because that is one of the main cultural shifts that we need to obtain, I think. So more or less, this is an overview. Of course, I am open for questions if you will have at the end, if I didn't mention something. And so now I can go on and read a bit from my chapter. So the title is Her Share of Divine Madness, the Role of Women in the Ancient Rites of Dionysus. Dionysus, well, I will explain who he is. So, on a very cold winter day, almost 2,500 years ago, a group of women from Delphi arrived in the town of Amphissa after much aimless wandering on nearby Mount Parnassus. Tired, cold, and not yet in their right minds, they flung themselves down in the market square and fell asleep where they laid. The local women saw them fast asleep in the middle of the town, and worried about the presence of many soldiers that were occupying Amphissa, decided to gather around them in silence to protect them. The following morning, when the strangers woke up, the local women gave them food and water, and after receiving the consent of their husbands, accompanied the strangers to the frontier, where they would be safe. This story is narrated by Plutarch in his book on the bravery of women, inspired by a conversation he had with Clea, a high priestess of Dionysus at Delphi. Apparently, the facts narrated by Plutarch took place around 350 BC, when a group of Maenads, women dedicated to the practice of an archaic ritual in honor of Dionysus, got lost while on their way back to Delphi. In this essay, we will take a closer look at them. Who were the Maenads? Why were they not yet in their right minds? What did they do on the mountains without the supervision of their husbands? How did the social and political context in which they lived react to their unusual spiritual practice? To start to give answers to these questions, we will first inquire into the nature of Dionysus. Dionysus is generally known today as the god of wine, sex, and intoxication, typically portrayed drunk, holding or wearing grapes, entrailed by his riotous crew of nymphs and satyrs, an interpretation typical of the Hellenistic and Roman times. The Hellenistic times is like the 3rd century before Christ. In the classical age, which is before the Hellenistic times, more or less the 5th century before Christ, so in the classical age, the god still retained much of his primordial nature as a vegetation and fertility god, an irresistibly beautiful androgynous young man, representing the vital, irrational, untamed, lusty essence of wild nature. In early literary sources, He is referred to as the power of the tree, blossom bringer, fruit bringer, and the sap in the plants. He's the archetypal image of indestructible life, representing life's irresistible impulse to reproduce itself endlessly, manifesting as both the force that pushes a plant out of its seed and the urge of sexual attraction. In animal form, he was commonly associated with the bull, the archetype of the masculine principle of fecundity and potency. His worship was very widespread all over classical Greece in the form of public festivals and processions, marking the seasonal changes and the phases of winemaking. In the Hellenistic age, private initiations also became very popular, given their tantalizing mixture of loud, fast-paced music, frenetic dances, the drinking of wine mixed with herbs, sexual licentiousness, and enthusiastic release of emotions. Initiations were open to everyone, including slaves, foreigners, and we could say immigrants, women, and homosexuals. And his tolerance often stood in this tolerance often stood in direct contrast with the moral values and civilized behavior promoted by the emerging Greek patriarchal society. Dionysian religion, in other words, was expression of a religious attitude and the memorial of a religious experience different from anything implied in the cult of traditional Olympian gods. Thus, Dionysian worship, though very popular, was often vehemently opposed, and the inclusion of Dionysus in the official Greek pantheon was often questioned. But how did it all start? From ancient sources, it seems that as early as the 8th century before Christ, there existed an archaic form of Dionysian rite, practiced by women only. They would gather in local congregations called tiasi, to then climb to mountaintops every 2 years to perform a mysterious ritual. Tiasi were composed of women of different ages, and unmarried girls were allowed to share the transport of the elders, evoking a touching image of young women carrying older ones up the mountain, despite the discomfort and risks that such an extreme practice could involve. The mountain ritual was known as orebasia, from is oros, to the mountain, and was mentioned in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, from the 7th century BC, but also by Alcman, Anacreon, and Aristophanes, before being extensively described in the Bacchae by Euripides in the 4th century BC. According to ancient iconography, Maenads wore fawn skins and ivy wreaths, and carried the thyrsus, a fennel stalk crowned with a pine cone. Their name come from mineste, meaning to go crazy, and has been translated as mad one, rushing one, inspired one, raging one. Another name commonly used was bacchantes, from bacchein, to revel, underlining the peculiar character of their practice. Bacchic rites, in fact, challenged the norms of socially accepted behavior for women, as evidenced by another attribute of Dionysus, hinemanes, he who drives women insane. However, no matter how insane they were, or maybe because they were insane, Maenads and their mysterious mountain gatherings have traveled across time and space in the work of countless artists, writers, poets, and researchers, who have been offering myriad interpretations of their myth. What did these women actually do on the mountain? What was the connection between the ritual practice and the participants' state of mind? And how insane did they actually get, and why? Thank you. That was it.
Thank you, Chiara. We're really pleased to have a European here, and we want to actually just discuss afterwards the difference in perspective, since many of us are descended from Europeans, and yet we don't really realize sometimes that the cultural evolution going on right now is not the same exactly in Europe as it is in the States, just as it's not the same in Mississippi as it is in California, kind of like, so we may be able to discuss that a little bit. Right now, I would like to introduce Annie Oak. Annie is the founder of the Women's Visionary Council, which we also call the WVC, a nonprofit organization that produces the Women's Visionary Congress and other gatherings in the US and Canada. The WVC presents the work of scholars, healers, activists, and artists who investigate non-ordinary forms of consciousness. Annie is also the creator of the Full Circle Tea House, a mobile tea service that offers a place of rest, hydration, and integration. She's the co-editor of the Manual of Psychedelic Support, a guide to setting up and running compassionate care services for people who have challenging drug experiences at music festivals and other gatherings. Annie is the co-founder of Take 3 Presents, which produces immersive, transformative art experiences. And she wrote a chapter for this fascinating book, and she's going to speak and read now, too.
Thank you, Kat. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you, Botanical Dimensions, for hosting this lovely event. And thank you, Chiara, for inviting me to participate in this book project. That, too, has been a great honor. I'd like to read a little bit from my contribution to this book. I'm not exactly sure where we crossed paths, sister, but I know you when I see you, kindred spirit, woman of the plants and the pleasure gardens, healer, seer, witch, herbalist, storyteller, conjurer, defender of your tribe. Nowadays we meet online, and still there is that yearning to be together in the physical world, to gather and observe the seasons, share ideas, drink tea, eat, and dance, mark rites of passage, watch over each other as we dream, hold space and vision our communities together. When I was young and scratching out a living in a big city far from home, books kept me company. But what I longed for was a community of like-minded women willing to exchange ideas. My mother gathered with her book club each month. Why not us? One winter during the 90s, a few of my women friends in Boston, Massachusetts, decided to read a book and meet to discuss it. We had shared interests in ritual, religious history, medicinal plants, and healing traditions of indigenous cultures. Before long, we had assembled a biography of texts and spent Sunday afternoons talking about these books. Our reading list eventually included much-loved books such as Plants of the Gods Their Sacred Healing and Hallucinogenic Powers by Schultes and Hoffman and Reich. Maria Sabina, Her Life and Chance. We had the version by Estrada in 1981. And The Spiral Dance, a rebirth of the ancient religion of the goddess by Starhawk, written in 1979. Immersed in these texts, it only seemed natural for our study group to expand our research by sampling the psychoactive plants and substances that inquisitive women like us had used for centuries. Many of us had started that process years before. We embrace the Greek meaning of the word psychedelic, which means to make visible or reveal one's soul or spirit. We explored the worlds inside the classical psychedelics that we then had access to: psilocybin, LSD, and mescaline, also cannabis. We created our own rituals to enter these experiences with due reverence and move beyond youthful experimentation. One day, we received a message from an ethnobotanist and author who had contributed to books on our reading list. I offered her tea in my cold little apartment, and she gave me 2 precious gifts. The first was a perfectly pressed datura flower, and the second was an invitation for a member of our group to join her for a private gathering of women in California who shared our interests. That person was Kat, who has given me permission to say that. None of us had much money, so we pooled what we could scrape together. I was the lucky one selected as our envoy. Off I went with scanty information about where actually I was to go. Basically, I had nothing more than an address and a phone number. Driving north of San Francisco, I arrived at a private home and found a group of more than 24 women who had gathered to talk. Promising to protect the identities of those present, I sat and listened to women who had 30 or more years of experience working with the substances and states of consciousness that my study group was then exploring. There they were, a community of psychedelic women fully living the meaning of the word psychedelic, manifesting their expanded awareness and alliance with plants and spirit allies. They talked fearlessly into the evening, exploring topics seldom discussed publicly at the time. What was learned during psychedelic explorations that could be applied to one's life? Was it safe for women to use cannabis while pregnant? What new synthetic substances being produced in the laboratories were worth investigating and which were best avoided? If the first waves of feminism were concerned with political enfranchisement, equal pay, and reproductive rights, here certainly was the logical extension of those freedoms, a woman's right to her own cognitive liberty. And what did these women do with the insights they gained with this freedom? A great deal, as it turned out. They cultivated their spirituality. They built schools, gardens, businesses, and organizations. They grew their own food, raised gentle and intelligent children, and served their communities as healers, counselors, and teachers. They were good psychedelic citizens. These women were also interested in other forms of altered states, not just those generated by psychoactive substances. They chronicled their dreams, meditated, prayed, created art, practiced yoga, and attended to their embodied wisdom. Here was a flowering community nourished and shaped by the social revolutions of the 60s, but arguably the spiritual descendants of the European midwives, herbalists, and wise women who had weathered centuries of persecution by the church. Their knowledge of medicinal plants connected them to a long tradition of witches and shamanic healers down through the centuries. Like their foremothers, they knew that courts and law enforcement or other authorities could target women like them for various forms of reprisal. They could be branded as unfit mothers and have their children taken away. They could lose their professional licenses and be driven from their jobs or their professions. This then was a largely private world, but also a joyful one. I felt lucky to be an invited guest and receive their trust. I made friends, listened, and received suggestions for further reading and study that I carried back to my frozen corner of New England. Back in our little study group, my cohorts and I warmed ourselves over these friendships for years. Walking into that room full of initiated women was a life-changing experience for all of us. Fast forward to 2006. I had left Boston for San Francisco to join the great tide of tech workers who arrived in that first internet bubble of the late 90s. I was working as a journalist, and I was in Basel, Switzerland, covering the 100th birthday celebration of Albert Hofmann, the great Swiss chemist who first synthesized LSD. The event was billed as the biggest psychedelic conference ever held. It was grand to see Hofmann honored in this way, but I was surprised to see that some of the 80-some speakers at the event, of those speakers, only 4 were women. How could this be? Where were all the women speakers? Women had surely participated in and benefited from the profound psychological insight, spiritual renewal, and social transformation sparked by LSD and other psychedelics. Women priestesses, together with their male counterparts, conducted the Eleusinian Mysteries in Greece for 2,000 years, dispensing a brew that contained the ergot fungi from which LSD is synthesized. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, Maria Sabina and other great female curanderas of the Mazatec had used species of psilocybin mushrooms in their rituals for centuries. Were the organizers of this conference disconnected from history and other psychedelic communities around the world? Had they been captured by some form of institutionalized European sexism? Was this a resurgence of a quantitative worldview that devalued qualitative forms and research and knowledge held by women? The answer wasn't clear, but there was much muttering in private rooms from female attendees who pointed out that women were significantly underrepresented at many such gatherings. We came to the conclusion that if we wanted to hear from women in the psychedelic community, it wasn't sufficient to complain or ask for permission to be included. We would need to hold our own events. Returning to California, I decided to do what my parents had done for their church and tie the portion of my income to support my own spiritual community. In 2007, I organized a gathering of women and our male allies at Wilbur Hot Springs, north of San Francisco. Inspired by the gathering of women I had joined more than a decade earlier, I assembled a wish list of speakers, including the most interesting women I knew who worked with altered states. Other women stepped forward to help with the project, and we extended invitations to people of all genders who we thought might want to attend. Given that many women in this community were more accustomed to private gatherings, there were safety concerns. Women had less money to defend themselves if they were targeted or harassed for sharing ideas. If we were holding public discussions on these topics, were we putting participants and their families at risk? There were no assurances, but I remember setting aside money for a bail fund and legal expenses. Fortunately, the owner of Wilbur Hot Springs, Richard Miller, was a firm ally, and we felt safe in the embrace of the lovely old hotel in which we hold our gatherings and its healing springs. 20 women accepted our invitation to speak, among them scientists and researchers, side by side with activists, priestesses, and artists. Speakers at that first gathering included ethnobotanist Kat Harrison, scholar Karen Vogel, and Amy Emerson, the director of clinical research at the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, Annie Mithofer, who works together with her husband, Michael Mithofer, who presented information about their study evaluating the therapeutic use of MDMA-assisted therapy. The therapist June May Roos discussed her work. Cindy Palmer presented images and text from her excellent anthology of women working on drug experiences, the book Sisters of the Extreme, which I think is being sold here, which she edited with her husband, the scholar Michael Horowitz. Fire and Earth Arrowwood, the founders of the Arrowwood Archive, took us through their remarkable collection of data. Carolyn Garcia, also known as Mountain Girl, an original Mary prankster and author of Primo Plant, Growing Sensimilla Marijuana, one of the first books on cannabis cultivation, also offered her insights. Many women spoke. And what I'd like to say about this gathering is that after we had our first gathering, we decided to form a nonprofit organization called and Kat mentioned it earlier, Women's Visionary Council. We based it on the Girl Scout Council, because many of us were Girl Scouts. We were just scouting a different part of the far horizon. And that organization persists to this day. We just held our 12th annual Women's Visionary Congress in Oakland this past June. We've raised money to distribute more than $100,000 in grants to women and their allies who are doing this work. And it's a great honor to now be the fiscal sponsor for SAGE, which is an expanded access site for psychedelic-assisted therapy in Oakland. So I want to cede time for our conversation, but I want to encourage you to support Botanical Dimensions, to buy this book, to support psychedelic women and their allies, and to imagine your own projects that you could do with your own community and your own imagination that is a direct continuation of the work that was done in the ancient world. And that is our lineage. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm just going to read a little bit because you've already heard from me on a couple of topics here, and then we'll have our discussion. My chapter in Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine is named The Embodiment of Feminine Qualities in the Psychedelic Self. Through my lifetime of psychedelic experiences, I have learned two great lessons that can be put into simple aphorisms. The first is be here now, which is the essence of what many have learned, but it cannot be remembered too often. It is so fundamental a perception of awareness itself, and it is so wonderfully succinct that one can write it inside one's own forehead, and it would be right there to remind us whenever we forget. Be here now. Psychedelics not only offered that guiding principle to us, but they also helped us understand what it means. We can feel it in these states and remember how it feels in our cells, then carry that awareness with us into quotidian or daily life. We owe thanks to that storied old seeker, Ram Dass, for renewing this ancient guideline as a modern meme for our subculture. He was inspired to be here now and to remind us, too, by his LSD experiences, as well as his other spiritual explorations. The second helpful tip, a profound tip at that, although harder yet to decipher, is that nothing is as it appears to be. This is not glib. I have learned this truth not only by examining this concept while on psychedelics, but also by living and working with native peoples whose belief systems have evolved and been sustained for many centuries, people who seem to understand and negotiate with the very nature of illusion. These are cultures that have sustained active and continuing animistic beliefs, cultures that practice shamanism and that educate their children through stories and hands-on experiences with nature. Some of them use psychedelic species of plants or mushrooms, some don't. They all seem to grasp the reality of illusions much better than our Western, materially oriented cultures do. In the deeply grounded awareness that everything is an illusion, one understands that everything may change from what it appears to be to something else at any moment. Everything. It's actually a fine rule to live by. It is one version of the principle of uncertainty. Uncertainty, as we have discussed, is a very feminine quality, allowing uncertainty. And by the way, this is a transcript of my spoken talk there, and I kind of left it in that sort of language, so in case it sounds conversational. My approach here has two themes: the perception of feminine or gendered personas in psychedelic species, the plants and the fungi themselves, and its parallel, the embodiment of feminine qualities in the psychedelic self. The conscious experience of these feminine qualities is as significant to the contemporary seeker as are those beings or perceived personas to the original cultures in which they arose. It's very hard to decide what of this to read, so I guess I'll just carry on a little bit in this, where I am. What is a feminine quality? For example, I was walking around Greenwich here in London this morning. I saw a woman very properly dressed, an official-looking woman, apparently walking briskly to work. She carried a smart leather purse, and on the outside of the purse was carefully printed, "Accept Mystery." I laughed at the ironic humor and thought, well, that's really great and very feminine, what I would call a feminine way of understanding reality, allowing for something to remain undefined yet possible. No matter the setting and structure, there it is, mystery in it or nearby. The recognition of mystery acts as a balance to the authoritative, the quantitative, and the taxonomic, which demand to know, what is it? How can we talk about it? Can we put it into words? Can we define what it is? Can we nail it down? Then move on to the next thing. That approach is more masculine, a perspective that we generally assume is more, in quotes, real. Yet we are dogged by the question and the misunderstanding of what is real and what is not real. We are too often imprisoned by the insistence on definition, on the structure of the expected. The distinction is undeniably tricky, because knowing and the pursuit of knowledge are human tendencies, not masculine or feminine, not male or female. Seeking knowledge is not gendered. In our worldview, what we accept, what we hold, and all that we unconsciously reject can be experienced as having qualities of the masculine or the feminine. Every one of us embodies both. And I carry on here. There's one word. I wanted to read the paragraph that had that word in it, and now I don't see it. So I think I will talk about animism just a little bit here. Or maybe this. Okay. Vessels of transformation. This quality of awareness that I am describing is a feminine one, or what we associate as feminine. Put most simply, as mythologists might tell us, or archetypal psychologists might say, the realm of the potential is the feminine element, while the realm of manifestation is the masculine. These are the classic ways of identifying the masculine-feminine dance. Being able to receive without measuring, just to hold, to embrace awareness, that's a feminine quality. Paying sustained, open attention to the possible. Our psychedelic investigations train us for this, if we care to let them. It is not purely passive, rather an active, awake awareness. How does one put a sunrise into words? How many of us in our psychedelic seeking, in our three-dimensional daily seeking as well, think we know what we are looking for? So we are hunting for something, for someone, scanning beyond the here and now, which is where just being begins. As the tiny, aged native Amazonian woman told me way back when, people from your place come here to the Amazon looking for something. They always think they know what they want, so therefore they miss what's all around them, and they don't hear what's whispering to each of them. This is one of the big lessons I've received. It's the listening. It's the being receptive to the murmuring of the universe. That's where the real wisdom is. You may then be ready to notice what wells up, something that you didn't even know to look for, an insight, an observation, something that lies beyond what your logical mind could have guessed at. Hidden wonders. That's good for now. Thank you. Thank you. So we are, in the spirit of all this we've just been talking about, we're interested in having a conversation and finding out what each other thinks, and then opening it up to have you ask us and us engage with you in a larger conversation. We're trying to make this feel like a living room here, and you're in the living room, okay? And so we're going to move away from the podium, but take the clock so we don't lose track. And I'll show you what we've had up here for a little inspiration. It's a river rock that I found and painted this past year and keep as an amulet by my door. And I just thought it would be good for us to have.
Mine is working. All right. So I'm going to pick my favorite question. I'm going to make it easy for me. So, yeah, what we can start by talking about is this concept of European indigeneity, which is something that even this formulation for me is new. I just learned it in these weeks that I've been here in California. So thank you for that. So, yeah, when I started my research about the ecstatic practices in the West, one of my drives was to really understand what was our Westerners, Europeans' lineage of these practices. Because I could see many people around me were becoming familiar with the ceremonies in South America and plant medicines from different cultures, which is great. I think that there is nothing wrong about that. And actually, I even got a message during one of these ceremonies with South American plant medicine when I was questioning, but is it okay to use these plants? And and I was actually in Portugal doing this ceremony, so it was even more weird to use a plant coming from so far. And the answer was, you guys are not in good conditions at the moment. You've been stopping to use your own plant medicines, and you have accumulated so much intergenerational trauma that you need these emergency remedies that are coming from far. So it was such a clear, I can also see from your reaction, such a clear information that I never had a doubt ever again. And I look at the use of these plants from this perspective. But still, I was wondering, what did we do in our culture? What's the history there? And so I became particularly interested in this time of the Greek times, because in these times, that time is really similar to our times. The Hellenistic times is a time when Greek culture expanded a lot. Alexander the Great went all the way to India. So many different cultures came together, and Greek was spoken as the first international language ever. So for the first time, many different cultures could speak to each other and come together and share information and share rituals. And it was a time when people were starting to become bored with Olympian gods, because their practice was very similar to my experience of Christian practices in my hometown in Italy. It was very how to say, it was about showing the others that I was a devoted girl. So I would go to the Mass on Sunday, but the Mass was not a transformatory experience. I would come in and get out in the same way. And in a similar way, the Greek people back then, they felt that these public processions and this display of devotion in front of the others was a bit stale and not really transformatory. And so they started to become more and more interested in other rituals coming from the East, in this case, Middle East or Anatolian regions and also Egypt. And so these rituals were known as mystery religions. So again, this word mystery. And back then, this word comes from a Greek word which means to close one's mouth. And so it's about the unspeakable. So these were practices that all include altered states of consciousness, different techniques. As I spoke a bit in my essay, dancing to repetitive beats over a long period of time, ingestion of psychoactive substances, even ritual sexuality, and other techniques. These were all inserted in the rituals. And one could voluntarily be initiated into the mysteries of this or the other god or goddess. So, for example, Cybele was a Middle Eastern goddess, Isis and Osiris, and Dionysus himself. And so the initiations were voluntary, and anyone could decide which ones to do and even add different ones. And so these experiences created communities of people that were initiated into the mysteries of the different gods. And then it would be such an important experience in the life of people that often the kind of information that we have is written on the tombstones of the people. So it would be declared on their tombstones which kind of gods and goddesses they were initiated into. And so I started being really interested in this because I could see many parallels, even in my world of the psychedelic festivals, with electronic music, with chemical substances. So something that apparently looks like it doesn't have anything to do with an ancient, revered spiritual tradition. But as Kat says, nothing is what it seems to be. And so I started seeing these parallels with these ancient rituals. And I started being able to frame my experiences of altered state within a culture, to really understand, to be able to integrate my experience in a cultural frame. And this was the main drive of my research. I could see lots of young people having really strong experiences and wondering, now they go back home and they don't have a way to make sense of it. And so starting to gather these informations and different pieces of the mosaic was coming together as a way to frame and integrate the experiences. And mainly it was about connecting with nature and feeling the connection with the whole, but also the connection with the others, because a main result of these rituals was the creation of a bond among the people sharing the rituals. And I could see this happening in the festival experiences. Once we've shared one of those, we are brothers and sisters, even if we don't know each other. And it really creates a kind of special bond that it's different than any other bond that I know. And maybe I would like to ask Annie if she relates to that, what is her experience of how to integrate those altered states, and what kind of information she finds useful to frame and give meaning to those experiences.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for bringing a European perspective to this conversation. I think it's really an important way for those of us of European ancestry, as Kat said, to acknowledge our own cultural traditions, especially the tradition in Greece, the Nordic traditions that were covered in the book as well. I think that by reconnecting with our own traditional heritage from the places where our own families are from, we can reclaim a lot of what has been lost in our yearning to reconnect to indigenous traditions of our own as people, European descendants. I think that the question that you raise about people having transformative experiences in festival settings is a good one. There are strong parallels between those experiences and the Dionysian cult experiences that you describe in the book. And then the question of how to integrate those experiences afterwards. I think by presenting information as you have in your chapter and also the rest of the information in the book, people can begin to get a historical perspective that will allow them to integrate. And also, I think it's important to create new language around those experiences. I don't like the dichotomy that is often set up between the so-called therapeutic use of psychedelics and the so-called recreational use of psychedelics. I think this is a false dichotomy. I like to refer to the transformative use of psychedelics. And if you're going to use a substance in a reverent way to do some internal healing for yourself, whether that's sitting with a wise person, whether that's during that experience, whether that's dancing ecstatically and connecting to joy in your life at a festival, that too is a transformative and healing experience. I think this concept of things that are recreational outside of this therapeutic must work with a therapist experience, this is false. And I want to create more language to describe states of ecstatic, transformative awareness, and that language can shift the world around us.
I don't have a clearly formed question about this, but it relates because I find that students here in my classes and it's parts of the conversation, the cultural conversation that I'm hearing right now, particularly among women, and not only women who identify primarily as psychedelic, but those who identify as healers and as herbalists and as culturally knowledgeable in different ways, that they feel so disconnected from their European past. And for some of us, we're fortunate that maybe, say, you're Italian and your Italian ancestry stays strong, and certain aspects of that are carried on over multiple generations, even though you've left Europe, or your ancestors left Europe. But for others of us, we have people who've come from all different parts of Europe, and they came a long time ago, and they intermarried, and they lived in cities, and they didn't relate to any continuity of their culture. And so I find the question is posed to me, how do I connect up with that in myself? How, if I approach it by study, learning from books, learning the plants, learning the European plants that have been brought here as medicine or as food or fiber even, or psychedelics, but the powerful psychedelics that most of us know are not European, and Europe wasn't known for, although there are very powerful plants there and powerful poisons, wasn't known for the kind of ecstatic, I don't want to generalize too much, but the LSD, ayahuasca, festival kind of things that some people approach it as festival, others as private searching, or by going to somewhere in Latin America, for instance, to have an experience. Or if you're a European, I understand people go to have experiences in Africa with Iboga. But my question is really like, how do Europeans, now that you've been in California watching our dilemma for a while, how do Europeans, people of European descent, find the thread in their own ancestry that is authentic enough that it's really informing us in these experiences and in our daily lives, in our values, and we're not making it up. It's not a fantasy that we want to believe in. It's really like if we were just slightly different than we are, we might just be talking about ancestors. How do we actually hear our ancestors? Do they become more audible when you take a psychedelic and ask to hear them? I mean, I have personal experiences, probably some people do, but I'm curious what you've picked up on about this particular dilemma since you've been in California.
Well, living in Europe and living in the place where supposedly the ancestry come from, it's really also a matter of visiting certain sites and connecting with the power of the site. Because the way that the temples were built, the places where they're built, there is magic there. It's not casual, the orientation, even if most of the time they are almost destroyed, but still the place where they lay, it has a lot of power, and I've had experiences of this kind. And in my case, I felt that I have probably, and this is just a feeling, this is the knowledge that the body-based or the intuition from the body. I have a feeling that I was really connected with the Greek times because also I just keep on wanting to read about it. So there is an urge that brings me to certain books and certain information, and I just trust that urge without questioning it with my mind. And so then when I find the information, I feel a pleasure that gives me the sense, okay, so this is the information that I was waiting to read. And so I have a feeling about my connection with ancient Greece. And then also I had the surgery this year and I was in general anesthesia. When I woke up, the first thing that came to me, I was on a marble terrace overlooking the blue sea in ancient Greece. And I was like, whoa, and I said that to the doctor. I was like, wow, it was amazing. So these kind of experiences that you cannot explain are clues to that. And at the same time, more recently, I started also questioning the fact that my colors are very white and blonde and green eyes. So I'm not the typical Southern European. And so I started also connecting with the shaman women from the north of Europe. And that's also very interesting, the essay that describes these women in Norse mythology called the vulva. And so you also get where the word come from. And like, whoa, okay. These power women that were not married, wandering around the land, they were nomads and going to visit the different communities and bringing healing and helping the different communities with whatever issues, with the animals, with nature, able to both influence the environment and the people and the animals. And so I started feeling these two sides of me, the Southern European and the Northern European. And so, I still haven't visited the Northern European sites. I'm really connected also to the amazing Neolithic stone circles and stone monuments that are in Europe. There's so many, everybody knows about Stonehenge, but actually everywhere in France, in Germany, in Portugal, there is amazing stuff, huge stone circles. So then also when you go back in time, you see how long you can go back in time, because the Greek times is 2,500 years ago, but then the Neolithic times is even earlier. And then to think that whatever happened during that time before Christianity is the result of whatever happened before. And so also this brings me to the consciousness that we lived way longer in the pre-patriarchal times than we have lived in the patriarchal times. And so this is important to have as a consciousness, because then this means that our bodies, our psyches, they are wired to a way of living, to a way of seeing the world that comes before patriarchy. So I think really once one starts the research, and the research can happen in 1,000 ways, as many as the people are, but once you start the research in your ancestry, the information will come. It's like scratching. You don't need to go very deep. As soon as you start scratching, the things start to appear. And so, yeah, I also don't want to speak too much because I can go on and on.
So, 2 questions. One, could you tell us what will happen at Eleusis in 2021? And my second question is for Kat, and it has to do with your work as an ethnobotanist. Could you, as we reconnect with the resonance of sacred sites, what role do you think ritual at those sites can play to bring us closer to the resonance of those sites and the plants that were used at those sites?
So, Eleusis, I know how to pronounce it the Italian way, Eleusis in English. Okay, so this is a place that is about 30 kilometers from Athens. And for those of you who've never heard of it, this is the place where happened one of the most famous, most renowned and respected collective initiations in the ancient world. For more than 2,000 years, people from all over the ancient world would gather there in September, more or less, to celebrate the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone. If you've heard the mother and the daughter, the myth of Persephone going underground for half of the year, and then the rite was the celebration of the return of Persephone to her mother, and this was seen as a metaphor of the life of plants that go under the ground for the winter, and then they come back. And we have to remember, for the people way back, plants meant life. Without plants, we don't survive. Them without us, probably, but us without them, we don't. So the fact that plant would continuously regenerate year after year, they would come back and they would make flowers, they would make fruit, and they would give harvest. This was what kept people alive. And so to honor this life cycle of plants was also to honor one's own life cycle. And so this event has a special importance in the psychedelic scene because in the past was Albert Hofmann the first to point to the fact that there was a sacred brew that was drank before the final night into the temple. And he looked into the possible psychoactive principle that could be held in the sacred brew. And they wrote this book called The Road to Eleusis, where they explained that possibly the psychoactive element was this contained in this fungus that grew on top of the barley with which the drink was made. And how this fungus, the active principle, the molecule, is like the molecule of LSD. And so this created like a huge game changer, plot twist in understanding the mystery of Eleusis. And so for the psychedelic scene, this is like, I want to say that this theory is still a theory. It was never proved until the end how they were able to separate the toxic part of the brew from the active principle for thousands of people with the kind of technology that they had. But so it had a huge impact in psychedelic culture because it's very probable. So if, again, in the sense of having an instinctive knowledge of what that could have mean, it meant that there was a collective psychedelic experience at the root of a Western civilization. So it's quite a statement, and so it's worth reading about it, and it's worth going there. And in 2021, there's Eleusis is going to be European capital of culture. So there's going to be different events organized there. I was also looking into the possibility of organizing an event. I shared about it with Annie. She also got excited about the idea. Let's see what's going to happen. So, yeah, and probably other people will go there. It will be very interesting, even from an anthropological perspective, to see how our culture will deal with this possibility of honoring this place. And so maybe I pass it to Kat.
Thank you. I'm glad that you just mentioned anthropology, and just as an aside there, I think part of what we're doing, and maybe the women, the people who contributed to this volume, is we're not only having these experiences and trying to understand them, but we're trying to understand our culture as it goes through these changes. We're all observing and meta-observing this transformation of the last 60 years, where these powerful plants and fungi and some version or derivation of rituals comes into a Western materialistic, largely individualistic culture, and this is what you get right here, you know, and you get a lot of smart women talking about it too, so that's nice. To answer your question, Annie, or to try to just address it, about how ritual might affect our sense of this ancestry or of these sacred places. I think that it's a big question, so I'm just going to take a little part of it, but I think that that one of the gifts of psychedelics, if we learn or choose to explore them in this way, is that we can actually learn certain techniques that make the psychedelic experience much more effective and more coherent, so it's memorable and is something we learn to take with us into regular life, but also that give us techniques that are useful in our daily life all the time. That some of us have learned a lot more about grounding, for instance, you know, something that we need every day in our regular lives because we're all living in a storm of information and our heads are flying all over the place and we can hardly keep our focus for, 10 minutes. I mean, you all know that this is an epidemic that many of us are not even trying to resist, and some are. And I found that in my first decade or so of taking LSD to begin with, and then mescaline and mushrooms as they became part of our creation and our trade in the West Coast subculture, and in my travels, what I encountered there, but that I was very fortunate to learn certain techniques like that, pragmatic things. Language has come out of it for some things like dropping in, like really letting go of everything else, not having expectations, learning to become a vessel. I feel like one of the ways that we can learn from, however you like to think of it, ancestors or the place speaking and what has happened in that place, the resonance of sacred places. And here in California, some of the spectacular natural places that we're able to go, which may or may not have a resonance of native people having been there for a long time, or they probably have it, but we may or may not be picking up on that. But we know it's beautiful, and we know it needs to be protected. And we put ourselves, some of us, out in nature and have these experiences and learn to be empty. This is one of the feminine principles, I think, is to learn to be a vessel, to learn to be hollow, because that's when, if you really are hollow and you put aside your wishes and your expectations and your what somebody else said it would be like, and you know, what you'd want to appear before your eyes and all of that, just put away all the desires and all the expectations and be hollow, then what wells up is what's real. What wells up is what you need to hear, the gift that you're given. It's like the woman in the Amazon said that I mentioned, if you're so driven that you know what you're looking for, you're not listening to the voices, you know. But that practice of becoming empty and letting whatever the mystery is well up and give you enough signals in as it does so that you have key words, you have key images to take with you, to meditate on in the future, to guide you, or to maybe even disappear and be remembered again like a dream, you know. And I think that for me, one of the great values of the psychedelic experience is that I learned they're almost physical techniques. I mean, I've called them like spiritual house cleaning, you know, and just kinds of emptiness, kinds of cleansing, kinds of grounding, kinds of breathing that then at any moment in our lives, and we have many moments of crisis and blessings and fear and emergencies and all of these things where we need to have these techniques. These are actually human coping skills that come from our ancestors. And so to use that state, part of the time at least, to practice how to be a conduit for whatever wisdom comes from the earth, comes from the ancestors, comes from your own innate view of the larger consciousness, you know, is I think really one of the great things that we can do with that state. And then we don't need to take a psychedelic every time we want to be in that state. We have learned the technique for getting there, and once you've learned it, it's right there. It's always right there, right beside you, you know. So that's my answer to that.
Thank you. One micro follow-up. Do you consider LSD an indigenous European psychedelic?
Well, it's got a resonance with the ergot and that ritual. Yes, I mean, and it's nature finding its way into our minds, you know. And there are many ways to do that. There are morning glories that have a similar ergot. Also, it's a fungus that grows inside the morning glory. It's not actually the morning glory, yeah, which they only figured out a few years ago. But yeah, those fungi, they're just always like fiddling with us.
It's about time that we open for questions and comments, and I think there is a microphone for that, for those of you who are brave enough to stand up and go.
No, just come up and ask your question, and then come. I don't know why it's so far up. Maybe somebody can move that slightly, but we needed to. What we're trying to do, I'll just tell you, is we're videotaping, and we realize questioners may not want to be on the video, so we want your voice on it, but we don't want to insist that you be visible. So you can move it out a little bit, though, so we can all see each other. Thank you. As long as it works still. Thank you. Does anyone want to ask a question? Or ask us to discuss something? Mm-hmm. Please. Thank you.
Well, it's on, I guess. Yes, okay. So I was just thinking about the whole thing about the European versus the Western here, Californian, And it made me think about a site in the Ukraine that's called Arata. I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but it's supposedly dated at 22,000 BCE. Dating is weird. I mean, the dating, it's very hard to trust dating, but at any rate, it's old. And so what's interesting about that site and this topic of rituals from different places, to me, what's interesting to me as an independent scholar and researcher is there's a site there, it's called the Stone Grave. It's much, much larger than Stonehenge. And they think that there was psychedelic practices there. And there's also the entrance into that area has these large carving statues that are all female. And so they think it was a very female-centered place of worship, practice, ecstatic, experience. And another interesting thing about it in terms of cultures is that the Tibetan, many Tibetan lamas think that that's their place of origin. So they have made pilgrimages there, as well as the Dalai Lama. So it's very interesting when we think about different cultures and rituals. And I feel that globally, cultures actually have rituals that are really ritualizing the same experiences. So in that way, there's all this connection, but we think it's all very individualized. But so my interest has been, well, what is really being ritualized? What is really going on there with all of these rituals and all of these, ancestral stories and especially the oral traditions before the patriarchal advent of craziness? That's not a question, obviously.
I'm going to take the end of it as just a brief question and myself and say thank you. And say, I think that also, just as in nature, culture, which, we are part of nature as well, but it's always seeking diversity. It's always seeking the million ways to express this with the same elements and the same energies. And that's why there's all these beautiful languages in the world, many of which are disappearing now. But the way that there, are thousands of species of seashells under the ocean that don't even come to the shore that we never see, and yet they diversified and found their way, evolved over hundreds of millions of years, interact with their environment, create something, take something, change something. Languages do the same, rituals do the same. It's like there aren't so many actual elements and ingredients, but there are endless ways to express them. And that's really beautiful. And that's why our hearts ache when we hear about the loss of diversity in nature, in language, in culture, in memory, So I think that kind of explains that diversity. Does anyone want to say anything?
I think here I would like to point to the paradox of the diversity in oneness, and how, it's really coming to the same point through going to the basics, to the primordial elements of each culture. We go back to these practices, to these very similar techniques, to these very similar ingredients, to the same experience of connection with the mother, with nature, with the goddess, because also we go back to this feminine entity every time. And it's so interesting to see. Also now we discovered as Western culture Pachamama, and we are still addressing it as this only positive and only benevolent and only caring figure, but actually the more we go back in time and the more the deities had both sides. And there were expressions of paradox, of duality, of ambivalence, This is something that is the same in all the different cultures. And so it points to something that we have lost, because then with time, God became the good one and the devil became the bad one. And then also this dichotomy and this dualistic way to see reality has been reflected in many other aspects and has created this division inside us. And with everything that came. But so I like to reflect again on this point of going back to the divine, the connection to the divine as something paradoxical, ambivalent, and to be able to see reality again in those terms. Where also, I think you mentioned it, Kat, in your essay, that even these entities that are associated with plants in the different cultures, they are dual. It's not just the good one. And so it's a reflection also of ourselves, and it's good to be reminded of that. Maybe.
I have a question. Maybe a couple questions. I have one specific question. You guys have done a lot of... Sorry, you guys have done a lot of... She's always should help. I told her I could do it myself. I was wrong. Oh, here we go. All right. Hi. I'm just wondering, my name's Jordy, by the way, if you guys have done a lot of research, different types of research in this specific area, and like Occidental specifically or West County, but I'm wondering, have you guys had, have you ever had experience, do you feel something about like an owl? Is there some sort of thing to do with like some universal experience here that has to do with the owl?
The owl?
An
the
owl?
bird.
With an owl?
Yeah.
Sorry, with a white owl here specifically while you are doing like research. I'm talking about as a universal, or do you believe in universal like apparitions or whatever?
I can say something about the owl. So there is a goddess that maybe now more and more women are aware of, that is Lilith. She represents the night, the dark side of the feminine. Mm-hmm. And one of her attributes is the owl. And so this represents, in a way, the ability of seeing in the darkness. Mm-hmm. And so it connects with the aspect of mystery that we were talking about before, yes. The possibility of seeing when you cannot see and being able to discern through skills that go beyond rationality and reasoning and all of that. Yeah. So this connects to a feminine quality, but also to the kind of experience that psychedelics or altered state can give. To be able to access that mysterious realm, the subconscious, the symbolic, and to be able to make sense of it.
Yes. So sorry, I haven't seen an owl on an acid trip or anything like that. I just am researching some things, and it has led me to trying to research specific things to this place, which is hard. And it's largely just being created and hopefully remembered, from your guys' type of experience maybe. And I've just heard, I just had a few sources of information where I just thought I would ask about it because, I've reached the point of just considering actual universally accessible things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Great.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for this. I'm curious that as this gets more into the mainstream and becomes more scientific, I wonder if we're going to try and quick fix it into a pill like we do with everything else. And so as three women who have worked a lot with this, how do you think we uphold the integrity of these beings with their historical context and spiritual context and get it out to the mass numbers of people who obviously need it?
I'd like to start with the word scientific. Again, language. What's science exactly? What we're talking about here is indigenous science. It's known and lived science. And it should be treated on an equal footing with anything else that's called scientific. There's quantitative and there's qualitative data. I think that both are valuable. And I think that there's a lot of pharmaceutical companies that are looking to make a lot of money from psychedelics and from this resurgence of interest. And I think that we should hold them to high ethical standards and be very cautious of their goals and what they want, and be also very careful of people trying to corner the market on any specific substance or therapeutic technique. I believe in cognitive liberty for the openness of ideas as well.
So connected to this point, I wanted to point out to a work that has been done recently. We called it PALA, P-A-L-A. This is, how do you call it? Like not an animation or like making drawings. How do you call it? Like a cartoon with words that explains how it can possibly be wrong. It can possibly go wrong, this thing of capitalizing on psychedelics. And because the great thing about seeing time as cyclical is that things tend to repeat. And so we can observe how we have been dealing with certain medicines and certain plants and how the capitalistic market works. And we can also foresee the way in which it can go wrong. It can just escalate and then become like something. And it really talks about ways to approach therapies and how therapies can be potentially, the risk is that they would get shorter and there would be less therapists for the amount of people that will want to seek treatment, and how this can lead to less quality but also more gains. And so really like a very in-depth analysis of how it can go wrong. And so hopefully with this awareness we will be able to shift and turn and find another way to be respectful more and to apply maybe the capitalistic way in a more conscious way. I don't know if this is possible. This is also a paradox. So it's a big question and it's really worth reflecting on it. So we called it PALA, P-A-L-A.
Thank you. It is a question, wherever that questioner is, that is much discussed among some of us, diehard old-timer types. And because, in some ways, like definitely if with the decriminalized movement, I mean, that's a different thing than the pharmaceutical companies and then research and psychological and psychotherapy and PTSD, it's related, but that's also a different thing. And then there's the whole prison industry and how much of that has been about drugs and how much of that has been about drugs that we know can actually be beneficial or that people certainly have the right to explore and all of that. So there's many aspects to bringing psychedelics to the surface and to the larger culture. The recent bestseller by Michael Pollan has made a lot of people who were afraid to ask about them want to ask about them. I see, though, and certainly there are benefits in all of that, even though certain voices are left out of those discussions and continue to be classically left out of discussions. But 2 points. I think that this surely is a stage. I mean, we have to evolve. Everything's in flux all the time, and we always have to evolve through every stage. And so we're we are Westerners, we are Americans, in fact. That means we're me-oriented, And even psychedelic therapy is just very me-oriented. It's how can I get over that thing so I can be freer to be a whole person, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if I look back if I look back at the psychedelic traditions and at how people have survived for this species for a couple of 100,000 years, a minute, in other words, but a long minute, and then I see it hasn't been about individuals. It's always about the collective, and these visionary states are about the collective. And when in this process of bringing psychedelics to the people, supposedly, do we get to where we are really lifting our collective consciousness out of the traps that we keep falling into, you know? And I think that's really part of the feminine, is to have it be that it's nourishing our roots, and that we are remembering and connecting together in this kind of, you know, dipping into these dream states and into these psychedelic sessions, and however we do them, but remembering that together we have the stewardship of the planet, we have the stewardship of each other, of all the different kinds of each others that there are, and that it's really ultimately a collective wellness that we're looking for. That's... Thank you. That's one point, but then also, and I've said this before, but I just have a very strong love of the underground. I think that in the history of undergrounds, that a lot of rich things just happen underground that cannot happen when you shine the light on them. And that we shouldn't lose that, you know? And so, you know, I mean, I think it just came to my mind as we were up here tonight, the hedge schools that the Irish, when Gaelic was banned by the English, they literally, the hedges were so big that the renegade scholars who were willing to do this, and the renegade children who wanted to learn from books in their language, would go carve out hedges and meet secretly and filter in and filter out so they weren't perceived, to go to school in in a room, in a plant, in order to learn underground knowledge about their ancestry, and to keep their language alive and carry it into the future, when they hoped or trusted that things would change and the oppression would not be so great, and that language would still need to exist. That is the underground, you know, and the underground itself, however you define it, is a very feminine thing. It's hidden, it's invisible, it's powerful, it's pervasive, it is not top down. It is completely horizontal. And that is, I think, an important thing to remember in this era where we're starting to shed daylight on the underground, and to turn some of it into products.
Hi. Okay, so this question isn't totally formed, but bear with me. I guess I'm just looking for resources or thoughts about, because there isn't necessarily, when we go to ceremony or take psychedelics and then go back into our individual lives, into like homes that are boxes by ourselves, and we don't have the experience of integrating it with each other necessarily. I guess what I'm seeing is just like a trend of a lot of people in my life that I care about, who they keep going back to ceremony or to these plants every time they start feeling bad or have a problem, instead of like having an integration of the things that they've taken from these experiences. It becomes like they just... so I don't see them having an experience of integrating the things before they go on to their next time of receiving knowledge from the plants. And so I don't know how to discuss that with them, or to give them resources about how to better integrate, so that they're not maybe, you know, and who am I to say if they're overusing it? But it's like, I just see this theme popping up over and over again. And I also just sometimes question the integrity of all the people holding these types of things. And I've had, like, you know, personal experiences of people not having integrity in these communities. And so I just don't really know where to trust or to turn for resources about this, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
in traditions that I've experienced that are not, created for psychedelic tourism, but that are actually like how the people maintain their lives. There are guidelines about what you do in the days leading up to it, and then what you do in the days afterwards. And there's, a kind of a dance during the ceremony of how you manage what comes up. Not every state of mind is helpful. And so, a fine practitioner and as I have mentioned before, I often see that it's a duo, a dyad that is being the shaman. It's not actually just one person, and often that second person is female, but sometimes the primary person is female and the second is male, or they're both female or they're both male. All of those can happen, but there is always this kind of masculine, feminine carrying of the roles, and that combined guardian observes that person is getting lost in the weeds. Let's bring the breeze, let's bring her back in, let's lift that one up. He's like melting into a dark puddle. I mean, it's a way of seeing people's states of mind as a physical presence or seeing them metaphorically, but then that's how they can treat it, is bring in the breeze, bring in the scent, lift the song, movement of some kind, that shifts it. And so there's a caring for the person properly in the session, but these are usually group sessions and not usually single person sessions. So there's a number of people to do that with, and that's where the song and singing together and breathing together can actually help the outcome. And then afterwards, for days after, there's the things that you ease back into life because you have opened up that vessel, and then you need to appreciate that, and then I like to go by a guideline, and I've been in a women's group for 25 years where this is kind of our refrain also is, what did you learn since the last time we got together? That's what we want to share with each other, is what have we learned since the last time? And then whenever you have one of these experiences, I mean, my personal technique is no matter how high or disassociated or ecstatic and in the moment or whatever I am, I'm going to find 3 key points, 3 keys that I can remember from that experience that I will put into a phrase or into a word or into an image in my mind, so that the next day when I think back, those 3 peaks, those crystals, they've clarified, and I have them then to think about for the weeks or months or even years until the next time, because I've managed to just crystallize them really into something that I can take away. But it's focused on the what do you learn and how do you carry it with you after, and how does it affect your life. If you didn't learn anything and you just got miserable, and then you think you want to try a different practitioner with a different form of psychedelic or different crowd, and maybe that will address that problem, and you do that repeatedly, which I know I have seen too. That's what the questioner was asking, and I've seen people doing that, and it just seems to be a cycle of kind of being stuck in hoping that something will fix them. And that's a little too much like the Western model, of like there's something out there that will fix me. And I know people are suffering, so it's not an accusation or anything, but I just think we're still learning different models, and we are juggling right now between the Western medicine model and the pill will fix things model, and then the process for which you have a lot of responsibility yourself in that process, as well as knowing what kind of help to ask for and discernment so you don't ask for the wrong kind, or you can perceive when that's actually predatory and not helpful. All of those things, we're learning those, but we have a long ways to go.
Yeah, we also have to wrap it up. So I wrap it up. So yes, thank you for staying with us in this night of exploring the mysteries and trying to define the undefinable. And thanks so much to Kathleen Harrison and Annie Oak and Botanical Dimensions and the volunteers and everybody here to hold space for this conversation. Personally, I will always remember this night until I leave. And I really hope that if you decide to buy the book, this will bring support through your path, also to find the kind of information that can guide you through the distress of being a modern human and trying to reconnect with nature, reconnect to each other, reconnect to the archetypes, find a way to define the undefinable, and evolve and transform as key feminine qualities. And so, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your patience in a long evening. And if you would like to buy the book tonight, they are for sale in the gallery right here. The doors open here and outside, and the authors are going to go to the library just down the way and sign copies if you'd like that. We have an illustration class coming up, I meant to mention, but Petra Tauscher teaching an illustration class on November 23rd. We teach a lot of botanical illustration here, too. So please get on our mailing list and join us again. Thank you.